All right, guys, it is great to be with you this morning, this evening, wherever you're watching it. I'm here in my office. It's Sunday afternoon. We've just had baptisms at church. Welcome to my office. If you haven't been here before, you're most welcome. This is one of my favorite places to meet with people at our church and to talk about what's happening in their lives. And so I'm grateful that you're here with me. This series that we're in is on 1 Corinthians. But before we get in, we've got two quick notes. First, if you haven't signed up for men's retreat, I'd love for you to be there. It's going to be a really awesome time. You want to be there. It's a sweet weekend away. It's really impactful and powerful. I just talked to a couple guys today here at church who signed up, and they were asking, what am I going to expect? And what I told them is 48 hours of community, great Bible teaching by Gary Gadini, some good solo or community time in the mountains of Santa Cruz. So if you're a mountain biker, bring your mountain bike. If you're a hiker, bring your hiking boots. If you want to go bowling, there's probably guys going bowling. Whatever you want to do, there's probably guys who want to do it with you. But that's the focus of the weekend, is it's getting away to be with the guys in our community. So I hope that you'll join us. It'll be a really amazing time. If you want to sign up, there's still spots available. You could come, and I really would love it if you would. But if you're not, there are still work for you to do here. So one of our guys, Scott Bigelow, came up and he said, hey, can you announce today that if guys aren't going to men's retreat, we need guys on parking team? Because apparently the parking team is going to men's retreat. And so we need guys to help volunteer on Sunday mornings with parking. So if you want to help with that, if you're not going to men's retreat, but you got time, shoot me a note, shoot Susan, Tim a note, and we can get a parking team together. Okay. Last week, Paul in the scriptures talked about the things that divide communities. And he said, there are some people where knowledge puffs them up about what is right and wrong, and they don't have compassion to people who are weaker than them. They don't spend time choosing to not deal with right knowledge, but choosing to love people. Paul says that the chief thing at the heart of a community that can fracture a community is a lack of love. And so he implores the church, go be people who love sacrificially, who choose to make themselves second and lift other people around them up. That's what true freedom does. That's what true knowledge of the gospel does, is it doesn't act high and mighty. It actually gets low, and it helps to lift people in love. And so I shared a story about a community that I was in where a guy and me had a conversation about going to a pub in Ireland and how it made him feel a little awkward. And he remembered all the times where he had went out and he didn't like when we hang out in a pub. And it was hard. It was hard for me to hear that, because he said, I know you're probably right, but I don't feel loved when you tell me that I need to just get over myself. And it was really challenging. That idea that Paul was dealing with last week leads us into this week's text. To locate us, this is a longer chapter. We're going to talk about the middle section of it, and next week we're going to finish it off. In the middle section of this passage, what Paul does, or the beginning section, Paul takes that idea of you can have knowledge but choose to not act on it for the sake of people, and he talks about his right as an apostle. So the church in Corinth was a church that Paul helped plant, and he helped teach them about Jesus. And usually when Paul helped plant a church, they would then raise a collection and they would help fund the missionary efforts. And it wasn't just Paul who was doing it. The other apostles had a right, according to Paul, to get paid for what they do. And not only to get paid, but to be supported on the way by the local communities. So that way the gospel could continue to spread. And Paul is writing to them, and he says something really interesting. He defends this right to get paid, and he points out all the reasons why. He spends the first almost 19 verses of this chapter talking about this. And then he tells them, but I choose not to make use of this right with you, so that way you would hear the gospel and you would believe. And that's a really interesting thought. And we have to understand it before we can dive into our teaching text. What Paul was pointing out is that at the time, there were people who would charge services for religious knowledge. And Paul said, I have a right to do that. I have a right to be supported. I'm an apostle. Apostles should get paid. Side note, I recognize I'm a pastor who is paid by your gifts. And first, thank you. I really appreciate it. I love that I get to work at this church to love and serve your community. CPC as a community as a whole believes so much that God has lifted some people up to lead in churches, that you guys help this church do its amazing mission. Like, we just got done with baptisms here at church. It was amazing. It's a result of your dedication to give your tithes and offerings to this church. So that way there are people within the church who can focus on caring for the church. So you go to work, we go to work too, but our job is to care for this local community. That was Paul's job too, but Paul tells the church he doesn't take a salary, and it's for a reason. In Corinth, there were people at the time who were charging for knowledge. I put knowledge in quotation marks because they would come around and they would say, I have the secrets to life. Let anybody who here come over here, and if you give me some money, I'll tell you what it is. This was awkward for Paul because Paul was also trying to tell people about knowledge that he had that was important for them. But unlike the people who were traveling around, he wasn't doing it to make money. He was doing it because he had knowledge that he needed to share with the people around him. And so Paul was trying to get rid of all of his rights, the things that he could have charged for, because for him, being the person who got to share Jesus with people was more important than getting paid. And so one of the things we know about Paul is he actually worked as a tent maker, like literally made tents. The people in Corinth would have known this because they would have seen him sitting there making tents in the marketplace. He was an artisan. Which leads us to today's text. Paul, riffing on this idea that he willingly gives up his rights as an apostle for the sake of the gospel, just like the church is called to give up our right to be right and to choose to love people. He's referencing this idea that happened last week between meat sacrificed to idols and the people who experienced that culture. And he said, it's better to be loving than to be right. Not to compromise our theological beliefs, but our posture should be one of love and building people up and choosing to become second. Which brings us to our text. This is our teaching text. Paul writes this, beginning in verse 18. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Though I'm free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. This is the word of the Lord, and all God's people said, amen. So my hero of the faith is St. Patrick of Ireland. Maybe you know him. St. Patrick's Day is coming up. It's March 17th. It's awesome. St. Patrick is one of my heroes of the faith because Patrick was someone who loved other people well. Let me tell you his story. Patrick was a Roman kid in the community of Britain in like the 4th century, before Rome fell. Earlier than that, sorry, in the 3-somethings. And Patrick was abducted by Irish pirates off of the coast, and he was brought to Ireland where he was a slave for 7-8 years. And he was a sheep herder, and he would tend the sheep on the countryside. And while doing that one day, as a slave, he met Jesus. He had this powerful encounter with God that wrecked and changed his life. And so he eventually escaped Ireland, went back to England, came back to his Roman community, his British Roman community. And what Patrick did is Patrick got ordained as a priest, and he went back to Ireland as a missionary. And the way he did it, missionary work, was really interesting. Patrick didn't go in guns a-blazing. He didn't go in like trying to convert people with harsh words and direct preaching. Patrick went back in, and what he would do is he would move into a community. He would live there. He would get to know the residents. He would love them. And as they got to know him, he would preach the gospel to them. And then they'd become Christians. They'd found a church, and Patrick would move on to the next town. And he did this around Ireland. And it was amazing. Ireland became the first nation after the Roman Empire, or outside of the Roman Empire, that became Christian. And it wasn't by the sword like the Roman Empire, where it was convert or we're going to kill you. Ireland became Christian because Patrick lived and loved people there. And he did that. What he did is what Paul was doing here. Paul said the way that he approaches mission is he is someone who tries to earn the right to be heard by the people that he's serving, and he does so that way they might come to believe. This is a really famous line among Paul, and people have used it and twisted it in a bunch of different ways. Paul says, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. What is Paul saying? What Paul is doing is he's laying out a philosophy for mission for the church. We're not meant to be a church that's insular, that is just focused on behavior management and just the people in front of us. And Paul is writing to the Corinthians because he's frustrated with how they're acting. He's frustrated with how they're approaching the community around them. He's reminding them, I didn't come to you in a way that I could have. I didn't make use of my rights. I'm not making you pay me. Like, I'm not doing this because I love you and I value the gospel. And he's writing to them, trying to tell them to get their head out of their butts and to stop living the way that they've been living and live a different way. What's the different way that he's telling them to live? He's inviting them to be people who live on mission. And he's telling them how to do it. He's telling them to go and to be in the communities around them. He says this at the start. He says, though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Frequently in Paul's letters, the way that he invites the church to respond is he says, this is what I'm doing, so do it. Follow me as I follow Christ. This is what he's doing here. He's saying, follow me as I follow Christ. Though I'm free and I belong to no one, which is true of all of you, by the way, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. It's important in the context, the slaves at the time were indentured servants. They weren't slaves in the sense of chattel slavery we have now, but they were people who were the lowest of the low in the society. And Paul is saying, I willingly gave up my rights and became low so I could lift people up. And he tells all the different communities that he does this in. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. Christians who still followed kosher law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law. Now, this is interesting. Paul does something unique here. He says, I became like one who wasn't under the law. But then he clarifies. He says, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. So sometimes people read this text and they say, I'm a Christian. I'm saved by grace. I can do whatever the heck I want. I mean, honestly, confession, when I was in college and I was in a fraternity, for the sake of meeting people where they were, I would go meet people where they were. And that went going to parties. And there were times where I would drink at parties or do stuff like that. And it was under the guise of, I'm on mission for the gospel. Really, I just kind of wanted to drink with my friends. And I look back on that and I think, man, my priority was probably the right priority, to love and to meet people where they were. But the way that I rationalized it was wrong. And this is Paul's big point. When the gospel becomes about us and our freedom, we've missed it. When it's about the people in front of us, that's important. And what he's trying to communicate to people is we can be people who are within the communities around us, but we don't give up our theological convictions. We don't give up what sets us apart and makes us distinctive. Because he wants us to win people who don't have Jesus over to Jesus. I worked for a while with an organization called Young Life. Some of you might know it. It's a youth ministry parachurch organization, and their whole focus is to help kids know Jesus. And the way that they do this is by pairing leaders, kind of like our rock leaders, with a local high school, and they get to know kids there. And they just get to love on kids, not in a weird way, but in a really beautiful way. Their whole focus is making friends with people so that way those kids might know Jesus. They call it contact work, and the philosophy is earn the right to be heard. You know that Christian who doesn't earn the right to be heard, right? Who yells at people, who tells people off for doing sinful things. Does that ever work? I mean, I'll tell you, the person who is the most effective at calling me out of my sin is my wife. Why? Because she spent years loving me, and I know she loves me. I know she's for me. I trust her because she has earned the right to be heard. So when she tells me something and says, Ryan, you might want to consider this. Oh my gosh, like a gentle rebuke from my wife is worse than a serious rebuke from someone else. because I know she's thought about it and she loves me and she sees that whatever she's bringing up is a problem. And Paul is reminding us the way that people feel loved by Jesus is when we love them. And so we should love them in Jesus's direction. That's how we're on mission, is we go love the communities around us. We go participate in the communities around us, not in an attempt to fit in so we don't stand out as weird Christians, but precisely because God has freed us from the things that enslave the community around us, we can go back in with clear eyes and open hearts to the people. What does that practically look like? It means we go and we coach and we love and we lead kids well. We teach them how to play soccer. We teach them how to go out of their way to run a route. Like, I was walking my dog around Osage a couple weeks ago, and I saw someone from our church, Coach Rand, coaching football, and he was giving some kids some feedback. And he's saying, hey, you didn't run it this way, but man, you're a great kid. And I saw this guy give really good, clear feedback to a kid about his football playing, but he was encouraging, he was loving. And I told him after, I was like, bro, you were so much like Jesus in that moment. Like, I almost started crying. And Rand was like, man, thanks for noticing. So Coach Rand, if you're watching, shout out to you, man, you're doing this. And I know plenty of you do this. Paul's invitation is you don't have to go to a foreign country to be a missionary. He wants us to have a missional mindset right here. But to have a missional mindset, we have to understand our context, because context matters. And so context is that thing that makes a place unique. Each one of these categories that Paul listed that he became like had particular things in their context that made them unique. And Paul went out of his way to understand them so he could speak Jesus to them. That's what St. Patrick did. That's what guys and girls, people here in our valley are doing. That's what God wants us to do, is to understand the community he's called us to so we can get to know it and we can love it in Jesus' direction. Let me share an example of how I didn't do this. When I was a youth pastor in New Jersey, the very first thing I said to the kids is, hey, I'm Ryan. I'm super stoked to be your youth pastor. What I didn't know is people in New Jersey don't talk like that. Here in California, you say that and guys are like, yeah, I'm super stoked to see you too. They don't talk that way in Jersey. And kids relentlessly mocked me. And it took me a while to earn the right to be heard by those students because the way I was speaking didn't match who they were. And so I wonder, here in this valley, how would you define how people are? Like, what makes them unique? I can think of things, but I want you to think in your group. What makes people unique here? What are they oriented after? What do they spend their time doing? How do they speak? What do they talk about? These are all important things for us to think about as missionaries for Jesus. And then Paul wants us to remember why we're doing it. Because God has saved us. Paul says, I become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all of this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Friends, we are called to love the people around us, not just because they're worth loving, which they are, but because Jesus first loved us and he loves them. The truest thing about everybody around us is there's someone that Jesus died for. That's the invitation for us as missionaries, is to go out and treat them like that. And I guarantee you, when you treat people like normal human beings, but as people who Jesus loved and died for, they are blown away. When you don't treat them as a means to an end, you don't treat your relationship with them as something to get something from them, but you simply want to love and serve with them, it blesses them. And so that's my challenge to you from Paul, is to go be missionaries around us. And to do that, we have to think about what our culture is, what our context is, and how we respond to that. So have fun in your groups today talking about this. Join me in prayer. God, we love you and we thank you for this time studying your word together. Would you bless and keep us until we're together again? Be with us at Men's Retreat this weekend. Be with the guys who aren't able to come and help us to have a really great discussion today. We love and bless you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. God bless you. Bye.